Hello folks, my name is Dr. Paul Pickell and I am a lecturer of geomatics at the University of British Columbia. In this video I will introduce you to machine learning using spatial data. By the end you should be able to understand the motivation for machine learning and how it works, describe some popular machine learning algorithms for working with spatial data, and identify the considerations for machine learning using spatial data. So what does it mean for a machine to learn? Well, we want to provide basic instructions to a computer that will enable it to undertake some task for which we do not necessarily have the solution for. The hope is that the computer will learn the new task and increase the range of tasks that the computer can undertake. We also hope that the computer will do the tasks better over time and with higher accuracy, and the computer will do the tasks faster and with more efficiency. With traditional computer programming, we as humans write programs or models that take some input data and produce some output data. This can be a challenging task because we must know what the desired output is in order to provide the computer with the correct instructions. With machine learning, this structure is flipped, so that the computer is provided with basic instructions from an algorithm that are used to write the program or model. There are several variations of machine learning algorithms that we will talk about in a moment, but you can imagine that there may be some problems where the output is known for a given input. For example, we might have some plots that contain information about vegetation and are labeled either forested or non-forested. There may also be problems where we might not know what the output is. In other words, we might have the information of the plots, like the number of trees and the species of vegetation, but we do not yet know what the label should be. Machine learning can solve both of these types of problems. There are too many machine learning algorithms to cover in detail, so I will only introduce a few for now, and then we'll go into more detail with one algorithm that you will use in lab. Some of the most popular algorithms out there include decision trees, k-means clustering, k-nearest neighbors, linear and logistic regression, and artificial neural networks. This list is not exhaustive, but the algorithms above are the most widely used for machine learning applications with spatial data. So now let's quickly take a look at how the first three algorithms work. Decision trees are probably the simplest algorithms to understand because they're very intuitive. Here we have some input, some plots that we measured in the field, and the task we would like the computer to perform is to classify each plot as forested, vegetated, or non-vegetated. The computer must use information about the plots, such as tree height and the normalized difference vegetation index, in order to create a decision tree that correctly labels the plots. The input information are called features. In this very simple example, we're only using two features for this classification, tree height and NDVI. Now perhaps you can see some initial weaknesses of this method. First, our two features might be poor predictors of the label. In other words, there might be better features that could separate the plots. Second, our chosen labels may not be accurate. For example, some plots may have short regenerating trees following a harvest or fire, so the site may actually be forested generally, but not according to this strict definition using trees higher than 2 meters. These problems highlight the importance of our role as machine learning practitioners. We must correctly define the problem, identify the useful features, and choose the correct algorithm that will produce robust results. Clustering is another popular algorithm. This algorithm works by clustering the input into like kinds. This is an example of an algorithm that you might use if the output labels are not necessarily known. Suppose we have these two features, number of trees and NDVI. Our task is to group the plots based on these two features. If we graph the plots in this feature space, they might look something like this. We can see that there appear to be three distinct groups, and we might hypothesize that these groups are our original labels: forested, vegetated, and non-vegetated. That's good, but how can we get a computer to recognize these groups without knowing the groupings or the labels? This is a job for k-means clustering. K-means clustering works by initializing some clusters by randomly selecting k plots. K is defined by us. Since we hypothesize that there are three classes, let's use k equals 3. The distance between all points and these three seed clusters is calculated to determine the cluster membership for every point. After all points are initially clustered, we calculate the mean and variance of the clusters in this two-dimensional feature space. We keep track of the variance within clusters every time we cluster, so that we know how good a particular set of clusters are. Then, We cluster everything again, using the mean values as the centers of the clusters. We repeat this process until there is no change in cluster membership, and we record the final variance of our clusters. The algorithm then repeats multiple times using different randomly selected seed clusters, and we keep track of the variance within clusters for each round of clustering. And the clustering that resulted in the lowest variance within clusters is considered the best grouping. In this case, the best grouping was the first round of clustering, which also corresponds to the clusters that we drew by hand. However, clustering does not tell us the labels, only the groups, so the last step of clustering is to interpret the groups and to label them. K-nearest neighbors is similar to clustering, but in this algorithm, the output labels are known for all inputs. So K-nearest neighbors allows us to predict the label given some input. The algorithm does this by calculating the distance in the feature space to the K-nearest neighbors, similar to K-means clustering. Euclidean distance is the simplest distance metric, which is given by the equation below. There are other distance metrics that can be used and optimized for this learning algorithm. K is defined by us, which tells the algorithm how many nearby neighbors to consider. K-nearest neighbors uses majority voting to determine the class label, based on the K neighbors that are nearest in the feature space. As you can see for this unlabeled point, the majority class can vary depending on the number of K used. We can also observe ties for even-numbered values of K, where there is no obvious majority. This is not always the case, but for this reason, it is best to avoid even-numbered values of K. So we've looked at some examples of machine learning algorithms. Now let's turn to how these algorithms actually learn. There are two primary ways of learning, depending on whether the output labels are known or unknown. If the output labels are known, in other words, we know what the label is given some set of features, then the learning is said to be supervised. Supervised learning uses human-labeled outputs to train the model. We'll talk more about what training means in a moment. In the case where the output is unknown or unlabeled, the learning is said to be unsupervised. In other words, our motivation is to approach the problem at hand with a hypothesis and separate or cluster the inputs into like kinds and groups. K-means clustering is an example of an unsupervised learning algorithm. Once we have the outputs from an unsupervised learner, then we interpret what the labels are. I am going to focus mostly on supervised learning for the remainder of the video, because that is what you'll be practicing in lab. I mentioned that a supervised learner is trained to recognize the output labels given some input features. To do this, we must have labeled data, and we must split all of our available data into two sets, one for training and one for testing. Both the inputs and the outputs are split in this way, so that we have one set of labeled training data that we give to the algorithm to create the model, and another set of labeled testing data that we keep a secret and we never show to the algorithm until the very end. The training stage involves showing the algorithm the labeled training data one by one, and sometimes through a series of iterations. Not all algorithms necessarily iterate over the training data. For example, K-nearest neighbors takes one look at the available data to make a decision. But many supervised algorithms will take multiple looks at the data through iterations or some type of shuffling. After looking at the training data, the algorithm creates a model, and then we give our training input features to the model that the computer has just created. And the model calculates some output, and then we can compare the output labels of the model with the actual labels from our training data. This process is known as validation. The validation provides some estimation of error for the model, and this error provides feedback to the algorithm, which then modifies the model and iterates over the training data again. So you can imagine the algorithm can learn to recognize the correct output labels with enough iterations over the training data and adjustments to the model. Testing is the process of evaluating the final model performance using the unseen testing data. So we give our testing input features to the model that was created by the algorithm, which generates a prediction or output label, and then we test how accurate the model was. Remember, the algorithm has never seen these testing data before, so the hope is that the algorithm has learned to recognize the output labels and is able to generalize the prediction to new unseen data. If the model performs poorly on the testing data and well on the training data, then we might conclude that the algorithm has memorized the training data, which is not a good thing. Let's recap what we just learned about supervised learning. We first split our available labeled data into training and testing sets. Then we showed the training data to the algorithm, which then produced some output. we compared the output labels from the model to our actual labels and validated the model. Then we showed the testing data to the model and tested how well the model performed using data that is never seen before. If we plot the errors from training and testing over the number of iterations or as a function of the model complexity, then we would expect to see the training error continuously trend downwards. The testing error should also trend downwards, but with sufficient iterations over the training data, the testing error will begin to increase again as the algorithm starts to memorize the training data. Now you can see why it is important to monitor the training and testing error when working with machine learning algorithms that iterate continuously over the training data. We can identify this inflection point in the testing error, which represents the best model that we can get. And we can stop the training process before the algorithm creates a model that memorizes the training data. If we stop too early, or we do not train the model using sufficient iterations, then we run the risk of underfitting our model. If we continue to train the model beyond this inflection point, then we run the risk of overfitting our model. In other words, there is a sweet spot in the learning process where our model is sufficient and is able to generalize to new data. We definitely do not want to overfit our model. So what do you think are some ways that we could improve our model generalization? Well, we can impose an early stopping criterion in our training process, as I explained before. We can use lots of training data to ensure that the widest range of variation is captured by our training samples, and that our training samples are representative of what our model might come across in the real world. We can shuffle the training data and present it to the algorithm in different sequences or randomly select subsets of the training data at each iteration. In some cases, we can generate new training data by transforming our existing training samples. And this is important if, say, your task is to train the computer to recognize if an image is a cat or not. You can take all of your existing images of cats, rotate them, flip them, skew them, blur them, etc., to create more examples of images with cats, and thus improve the generalization of the model. And this is a real example. You can go upload an image to this website, isitacat.com, and a neural network will give you its prediction. We can also randomize the predictor features that are used in the model, and I will show you an example of this in a moment. And finally, we can train many models in different ways, with different sets of training data, and with different parameters, and then ensemble them together so that each model casts one vote for the predicted label. Now I want to turn to a specific algorithm that you will use in lab, called random forests. Random forests is a decision tree classifier, but unlike the simple decision tree algorithm that we looked at earlier, random forest is an algorithm that grows multiple decision trees using different combinations of the features and training data. The name of the algorithm comes from the significant randomization and shuffling of the training data, and the fact that we are growing many trees into a forest, hence random forests. Random forest relies on a process known as bootstrapping. Bootstrapping takes our initial training data and samples from it with replacement to create a new training data set that will be used to grow one decision tree. The idea here is that some of our training samples will be left out or duplicated in the bootstrap dataset. For example, sample number 3 was selected twice, and sample number 1 was omitted from the bootstrap dataset. This is important because we're not showing the algorithm all of the training data at once, and any samples that we leave out can be used to validate the output of any decision tree where that sample was left out. For example, sample 1 that was left out of the first bootstrap sample can be shown to all of the other decision trees where that sample may also be missing. And this allows us to report the out-of-bag error during the training process. Once our training data are bootstrapped, Random Forest grows a decision tree by randomly selecting M features. Suppose from our earlier example, in addition to tree height and normalized difference vegetation index, we also had percentage of vegetation cover, the biogeoclimatic zone, and species richness recorded for each of our plots. The random forest algorithm would randomly select M features from this set of 5 features to grow the decision tree. We have to specify M for the algorithm, but each new decision tree is grown using some random combination of M features and some bootstrap training data. At this point, you might be thinking that none of these decision trees will be very good at all because they're only using a subset of the overall training data. And you would be correct. Each tree individually is a poor learner, but random forest relies on growing hundreds of these trees and then aggregating them together to vote on the output label. This process of bootstrapping and aggregating is known as bagging. So if we have an input that has never been seen before, then we show it to each tree which casts a vote for the output label. The label with the majority of votes is the final label that is output by the model, which in this case would be forested. Now let's turn to some issues that machine learners face when working with spatial data. Because we are dealing with data in the spatial domain, and sometimes even in the temporal domain, we must consider the impact of autocorrelation on our training dataset. Autocorrelation follows Tobler's law of geography, which says that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Spatial autocorrelation can impact how representative our training data are of the underlying spatial process. Machine learning algorithms are very good about picking up patterns and trends that are not always obvious to us. So our model might inadvertently learn the spatial autocorrelation structure of the training data and do a very poor job of generalizing to new locations or sites outside of the study area. If we model spatial or temporal autocorrelation of the input features, then we can determine a spatial lag or distance that would be appropriate to sample our training data. This is especially a concern when working with imagery, because we may have training data that are available wall-to-wall across our entire study area. And this brings me to another issue about correlation, multiple collinearity among our predictor features. Whether we are doing supervised or unsupervised learning, we must always choose what our features will be. This is a great responsibility, because as we saw at the beginning of the video, using inappropriate features can lead to a poor learner. Ideally, we want features that are decorrelated. In other words, we do not want redundancy in the feature space. This is again an issue when working primarily with multispectral remote sensing data, because many of the bands in the image may be highly correlated. One solution for dealing with multicollinearity is to do a principal components analysis of your input features. This pre-analysis provides two benefits. First, it decorrelates your input features, and it reduces the dimensionality of your feature space, which is another common issue with big data problems. Finally, the last consideration I will leave you with is the issue of unbalanced class labels in the training data. It is very common to observe unbalanced classes in natural data. In other words, we might have one very abundant class and several very rare classes. This is usually true for both the real world that you're trying to model, as well as the output that you will generate from your model. Class imbalance can cause our machine learning algorithm to become a lazy learner, because if you think back to the diagram that I showed earlier, where the model is evaluated during the training process, if 80% of the training samples are from one class, and our algorithm is rewarded for lowering the training error of the model through this feedback loop, then the algorithm will focus on learning the patterns of the abundant class, and it contributes the most change to the training error. As a result, rarer classes will have poorer accuracy. One solution for this is to use a balanced sampling design, so that the algorithm is forced to learn the patterns of all classes equally. I highly recommend the Olofsson et al. Paper below, which provides best practices for sample design and land cover mapping. So now we've reached the end of this brief introduction to machine learning with spatial data. I want to leave you with some parting words of wisdom and caution when undertaking your own machine learning analyses. First, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Models are simply representations of reality, and it does not matter whether it was created by a human or a machine. A useful model will have some estimation of error associated with it. You should get into the practice of reporting and interpreting the errors of your models. Second, models are only as good as the data veracity. In other words, low-quality training data going in will create a low-quality model. As humans, we still have a significant role to play in appropriately defining our environmental problems and choosing the appropriate machine learning algorithm and predictor features. As I've showed you, models are prone to overfitting and underfitting, but we have tools and strategies to deal with those issues. Finally, as you consider using spatial data in your machine learning project, consider the issues that I just raised about autocorrelation, multicollinearity, and sample design. I hope that you will take these tools and knowledge into your next machine learning project, but remember, learning is a process that requires training, so this is just a starting point for you. Now it's your turn. We'll be looking at these spatial data in the learning activity. Your task is to design your own machine learning algorithm to label these 10 points as burned or unburned. These are a small sample of the real data that you will use in lab. Here I have mapped these data into a two-dimensional feature space using the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, NDVI, and the Normalized Burn Ratio, NBR. Both of these indices were derived from a Landsat satellite image. These are what the data look like that you'll be using in learning activity. It's just a table with 10 labeled points and 1 unlabeled point. The 2 columns indicate NDVI and NBR values for each point. Higher NDVI values indicate greener pixels, whilst lower NBR values indicate higher fire severity. You can get these data in the video link description if you scroll down. That's all for now. See you soon.